There is a woman in the Bible whose name most people have never spoken out loud. A woman who, on a single ordinary night in the middle of an ancient desert road, reached down into the darkness, took a sharp stone into her hand, and did something so fierce, so precise, and so theologically charged that it stopped the hand of God himself. She did not pray about it. She did not wait for someone to come and help. She did not hesitate. She saw what was happening. She understood it when no one else in the world could have. And she acted. And because she acted, one of the most consequential men in all of human history survived the night. Because she acted, 2 million enslaved people would eventually walk out of Egypt. Because she acted, the 10 Commandments were given. Because she acted, a covenant nation was born. Her name was Zipporah. And almost nobody knows her story. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Take just a moment right now and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would genuinely love to hear from you. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because if this story is any indication of what we do here, you do not want to miss what is coming next. Now, let us go back. Let us go back 3,500 years to a world so different from ours that its laws, its gods, its rituals, and its geography would be unrecognizable to a modern eye. And yet, its human emotions, its jealousy, its fear, its ambition, and its love are so familiar they could have been written yesterday. Let us go back to a world where one empire ruled the known earth with an iron fist, where rivers ran red not with metaphor but with judgment, where a burning bush that refused to burn up was not a hallucination but an invitation, and where a woman who grew up as the daughter of a desert priest looked at her dying husband in the dark of a roadside inn and understood in a split second what God required and why the most important man in the world was about to lose his life before his mission even began. This is the story of Zipporah. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. This is not a story you have heard. You may think you have, because you have read Exodus. You may think you have, because you sat through Sunday school, or Bible study, or a sermon series on Moses. But here's the truth. Most preachers skip this passage entirely. Theologians have called it one of the most perplexing conundrums in the entire Torah. The Jewish Study Bible describes it as extraordinarily puzzling. Scholars at Bible.org have written that for mystery, mayhem, and sheer baffling strangeness, nothing else in the Bible quite compares to the story of Zipporah and what has been called the bridegroom of blood. 3 verses, 3 short, ancient, ambiguous verses, buried in the middle of the 4th chapter of Exodus. And they contain a secret that has kept the greatest minds in 3,000 years of scholarship arguing without resolution. Here is the verse. Exodus 4:24. Read it slowly because every single word matters. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. That is it. That is the full verse. God, the same God who had just appeared to Moses in the burning bush and commissioned him with the most important mission in Israelite history, that God, on the road to Egypt, sought to kill Moses, not Pharaoh, not an enemy. Moses. The man he had just chosen, the man he had just spoken to face in a fire that refused to die, the man he had just given miraculous signs and supernatural authority. That man, God sought to kill him. And if you are sitting there right now wondering how that is possible, wondering what could have brought the most powerful force in the universe to a roadside inn in the ancient desert in order to execute the very servant he had just commissioned, then you are asking exactly the right question. There are 4 mysteries at the center of this story, and they have been argued about for 3,000 years without resolution. Mystery number 1. Why did God try to kill Moses right after commissioning him at the burning bush? What covenant had Moses broken so severely that his mission was about to be ended before it began? Mystery number 2. How did Zipporah, a Midianite woman, not an Israelite, know exactly what ritual could stop God's judgment in that moment, when even Moses seemed completely unable to help himself. Mystery number 3. Why did Moses send Zipporah away before entering Egypt, and was that decision made to protect her, or was there something more complicated in that separation? And mystery number 4. Who is the Cushite woman mentioned in Numbers 12? The woman that Miriam and Aaron used to challenge Moses' authority. And what does her appearance in that story tell us about what was really happening in Zipporah's life long after the night at the inn? Stay with us, because every one of these mysteries is about to be answered. The world that produced Moses and Zipporah was a world that most of us have only glimpsed in fragments. We know Egypt from the movies. We know Moses from the paintings on church walls. But the actual historical and archaeological reality of the ancient Near East in the 13th century, before the Common Era, was a place of staggering complexity and staggering brutality. Egypt, under the New Kingdom pharaohs, most likely the Ramessid dynasty, with Ramesses II ruling as one of the most powerful monarchs the ancient world had ever produced, was not merely a nation. It was a totalizing empire. It stretched from the Sudan in the south to Syria in the north. Its army was the most disciplined and feared military force on earth. Its economy was fueled by the labor of enslaved peoples from dozens of conquered territories. Its religious system was a web of hundreds of gods, each demanding specific rites, specific offerings, and specific loyalty. And at the very center of it all sat a pharaoh who believed, and whose subjects believed, that he was himself a god. Midian was not a kingdom in the conventional sense. It was a confederation of nomadic tribes occupying the territory east of the Gulf of Aqaba, what today corresponds roughly to northwest Saudi Arabia and parts of southern Jordan. The Midianites were descendants of Midian, the son of Abraham and his wife Keturah, whom Genesis 25 introduces plainly. They were not Israelites. They were not Egyptians. They were a people shaped entirely by the desert, fierce, mobile, deeply spiritual in their own tradition, and skilled in the arts of survival that only the wilderness teaches. Their priest, the man known variously in Scripture as Reuel and as Jethro, was the spiritual leader of his people, the keeper of their sacred traditions, and a man of such remarkable wisdom that he would later, after the Exodus, after the parting of the sea, after the 10 Commandments, sit Moses down and teach him how to govern a nation. This was the family Moses was walking into, and Zipporah was this man's daughter. Jethro, the man who would become Moses' father-in-law and Zipporah's father, is identified in Scripture with 2 names. In some passages he is called Reuel, which means friend of God. In others he is called Jethro, which most scholars translate as excellence or preeminence. The Talmud, in its characteristic style of multiplying meaning, suggests that he was given the name Jethro because he added a passage to the Torah, that his wisdom was so recognized that it earned him a permanent place in the sacred text. What is clear from every source that touches Jethro's story is that this man was remarkable. He was the spiritual leader of his people. He was a priest, and in the ancient world, the office of priest was a combination of theologian, judge, counselor, diplomat, and keeper of sacred memory. Jethro held all of those functions simultaneously for the Midianite Confederation, and Zipporah grew up in his household, at his feet, learning everything he knew. Into that world, a Hebrew woman named Jochebed gave birth to a son. The year was approximately 1300 to 1250 before the Common Era. Pharaoh had issued a decree, a genocide dressed in bureaucratic language, ordering that every newborn Hebrew male be thrown into the Nile. The Hebrew population was growing too fast. They were too numerous, too strong, too potentially dangerous to the empire's stability. And so, the solution, as empires throughout history have reached for when they fear the people they oppress, was elimination. Kill the boys, keep the girls, break the bloodline, break the spirit, break the future. Jochebed refused. She hid her son for 3 months, and when she could hide him no longer, she did something that defies every maternal instinct in the human body. She placed him in a basket woven from papyrus reeds, sealed it with tar and pitch, and set it into the current of the Nile. What Jochebed understood that makes this act extraordinary rather than merely desperate is that she was not simply abandoning her child to chance. The section of the Nile where she placed the basket was near the place where Pharaoh's daughter bathed. She sent Moses' older sister, Miriam, to watch from a distance. This was a calculated act of faith, disguised as an act of surrender. And it worked. Pharaoh's daughter found the basket. She heard the baby crying. And the text of Exodus 2 says something quietly remarkable. She had compassion on him, and she said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." She knew. She knew exactly what this child was, exactly what her father's law said should happen to him, and she chose to keep him anyway. And then Miriam appeared from the reeds and offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and Miriam brought Jochebed, Moses' own mother, back to nurse her own son, under royal protection, inside the house of the man who had ordered his death. Moses grew up in that palace. He was educated in the finest schools the Egyptian empire offered. He learned mathematics, architecture, military strategy, statecraft, and religion. He spoke Egyptian as his first language. He dressed as an Egyptian. He moved through the corridors of power as someone who belonged there. And yet somewhere inside that palace, somewhere in the years of education and privilege, there was a thread of identity that his mother had planted in him during those early nursing years, a thread that connected him to the Hebrew people he could see every day from the palace windows, laboring under the overseer's whips in the blazing sun. He was Egyptian enough to pass in the palace. He was Hebrew enough to feel the weight of every lash he witnessed. He was a man caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, and that tension would eventually erupt in a single moment of violence that changed everything. It happened on what the text suggests was an ordinary afternoon. Moses was out and about, perhaps inspecting construction, perhaps on a walk, when he saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. The text says he looked this way and that. He saw that no one was watching. And then he killed the Egyptian, and he hid the body in the sand. That detail, hiding the body, tells us something about Moses' state of mind. This was not a warrior's killing, performed openly in the heat of combat. This was a desperate act followed immediately by an attempt at concealment. He did not want to be discovered. He was not launching a revolution. He was a man who had crossed a line and immediately knew it. The next day, when he tried to intervene in a conflict between two Hebrew men, one of them said to him, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" The secret was out, and word reached Pharaoh, and Pharaoh issued a death warrant for him. Moses ran. He ran into the wilderness of Sinai. He ran across the desert peninsula that today sits between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. He ran until the gleaming towers of Egypt's cities disappeared behind him, and there was nothing but rock and sand and the punishing sun above. He had nothing, no plan, no allies, no clear destination, no God he felt he could call on. He was a murderer in exile, stripped of every privilege and every identity that had sustained him, and walking into an emptiness that matched the emptiness inside him. Most men in that condition do not survive. Most men in that condition find a way to stop walking, but Moses reached a well in Midian, and at that well everything that came after began to take shape. Not because of a divine vision, not because of a burning bush, because of water, and because of 7 sisters, and because one of them had eyes that saw a man from Egypt who was something more than what he appeared to be. The daughters of Jethro came to the well that day, for the most ordinary of reasons, to draw water for their father's flocks. It was their daily task, as it had been every day of their lives. But that day, the shepherds of the region drove them away from the well to water their own flocks first, as they apparently did regularly, the strong taking what they wanted from those with less power to resist. That dynamic is as old as human civilization, and it was playing out again at a well in Midian. And then Moses stood up. He was exhausted. He was in hiding. He was a man with a death warrant in his name in the most powerful country on earth. The last thing a rational fugitive does in that situation is make himself conspicuous, by defending strangers. But Moses stood up. He drove the shepherds away. He drew the water. He helped the women water their flocks. And when Jethro's daughters returned home earlier than usual, Jethro asked how they came back so quickly. And they said, "An Egyptian man helped us." Notice what they called him. An Egyptian man. Not a Hebrew, not a slave, an Egyptian man. Because Moses still looked like what he had been trained to be, even after fleeing everything that identity had cost him. Identity is a strange and stubborn thing. Jethro's response to this news is one of the quiet thunderbolts of the Exodus narrative, and almost nobody stops to notice it. He did not simply shrug and say, "Fine, well done." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why did you leave the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." The priest of Midian recognized the arrival of this stranger, not as coincidence, but as something else entirely. There is a tradition in desert culture, ancient and unwritten, that a stranger who appears at a well and shows generosity to your family is not to be turned away. Jethro understood this, and there may have been something more, some spiritual discernment in the man who kept the sacred traditions of Midian, that told him this particular Egyptian was not what he appeared to be. Among the 7 daughters at that well, one is more significant than the text immediately reveals. Her name was Zipporah. She was Jethro's eldest daughter, and in the ancient world, the eldest daughter of a priest was not simply a household manager. She was her father's primary assistant, the one who carried forward his knowledge with the most direct access and the most responsibility. The women of a priestly household in the ancient Near East were educated in sacred matters in ways that women in ordinary households simply were not. Zipporah, by virtue of her birth and her father's vocation, was one of the most theologically literate women in the entire region of the ancient desert. Her name means bird in Hebrew, specifically a small, swift bird. The name suggests grace, quickness, and a kind of freedom that larger, heavier things do not possess. As we will come to see, her name describes her perfectly, because when the moment of crisis came, she moved with the speed and precision of something that was born, knowing exactly what it needed to do. Moses accepted Jethro's invitation. He sat at Jethro's table. He ate bread. He stayed. And in the way that the ancient world arranged such things, through proximity, through shared labor, through the slow accumulation of trust, Moses was eventually given Jethro's daughter Zipporah in marriage. The Bible compresses this entire relationship into a single sentence. It says Moses was content to dwell with the man, and Jethro gave him Zipporah. But let us not allow that compression to fool us into thinking it was a small thing. Zipporah was the daughter of a priest. She would have grown up watching her father perform sacred rites. She would have learned the names and requirements of the divine. She would have understood covenant, the binding agreements between a people and their God, in a way that was not theoretical, but practical, lived and embodied in her entire upbringing. This was no ordinary woman, and Moses, though he did not yet know it, had just been placed beside the one person on earth who would one day reach into the darkness and save his life. The Midrash, the ancient body of Jewish interpretive literature that fills in the gaps of the Torah, offers a fascinating backstory to Moses' time in Midian that most people have never encountered. According to the tradition recorded in the Exodus Rabbah, when Moses arrived at Jethro's household and revealed that he was a fugitive from Egypt, Jethro recognized him as the man wanted by Pharaoh for the murder of an Egyptian official. And Jethro, calculating that handing Moses over might earn him favor with the Egyptian crown, threw Moses into a pit and left him there. Left him there for 10 years, according to some versions of this tradition. And who kept Moses alive during those years, lowering food and water down into the pit? Zipporah, before they were married, before there was any formal relationship between them. She fed him. She sustained him. She was the reason he survived long enough to be released. If this tradition holds any historical weight at all, then Zipporah saved Moses' life not once but twice. And the first time she did it entirely without recognition, entirely without reward, entirely out of something that can only be described as conscience. Moses and Zipporah built a life in Midian, They had a son, and Moses named him Gershom, which means, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. That name tells you everything about Moses' inner state during those years. He was present in Midian, he was functioning in Midian, he had a family in Midian, but he felt at his core like a stranger everywhere he went. He was not Egyptian enough for Egypt, he was not Hebrew enough for Israel, and he was not Midianite enough for Midian. He was a man without a country, keeping his father-in-law's flocks in the Sinai Mountains, living at the intersection of multiple identities and belonging fully to none of them. Later, Zipporah gave him a second son. Moses named him Eliezer, which means, my God is my help. The shift between those two names is subtle but significant. Gershom, I am displaced. Eliezer, but God has helped me. Between those two names, something in Moses had moved. Something had begun, however quietly, to settle. 40 years passed in Midian. Let that number land. 40 years. Moses was 40 years old when he fled Egypt. He was 80 years old when the burning bush changed everything. Between those two numbers, there is an entire generation of human life, a lifetime by the standards of most ancient people, spent in the desert, in Jethro's household, tending Jethro's flocks, raising 2 sons, living with Zipporah, watching the seasons change over the Sinai landscape in the slow rhythm of a life that history would have recorded as insignificant if history had bothered to notice it at all. The man who would become the greatest prophet in all of Israel's history spent 40 years in obscurity so complete that not a single event of those decades is recorded in the biblical text. The biblical narrative simply moves from Moses running into the desert to Moses at the burning bush, with 40 years compressed into the phrase, now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Zipporah lived those 40 years. She was not compressed. She was present in every one of them. She watched Moses come to Midian as a broken man, and she watched him rebuild. She watched him become a father, and then a better shepherd than most men born to it, and then a trusted member of a community that had no reason to trust him at first. She watched the Egyptian prince in him fade, and the desert man emerge, the slower gait, the sun-dark skin, the patience that only comes from watching goats pick their way across rocky ground for 1,000 mornings in a row. She knew him before he knew himself. And when the burning bush happened, when Moses came home from the mountain with that look on his face, the look of a man who had seen something that his vocabulary was not adequate to describe, Zipporah was the first person he had to tell. She was the first human being on earth who heard that God had appeared in a fire that would not burn and had spoken the name I am, and had commissioned her husband to go back to the country where a death warrant had been waiting for him for 40 years. And then, on a day that began no differently from the 10,000 days that had come before it, something happened on the slopes of a mountain in Sinai that would unravel everything. Moses was leading the flock further into the wilderness than usual. The text says he came to Horeb, the mountain of God, and there a bush was burning, but it was not being consumed. It burned and did not burn up. Moses saw it and said to himself, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. That phrase, I will turn aside, is one of the most important phrases in the entire Exodus narrative. Moses could have kept walking. He could have told himself it was a trick of the light, a reflection, a dry season phenomenon he didn't understand. He turned aside. He chose to investigate the thing that didn't make sense. And that choice, that single act of curiosity and openness, changed the course of human history. From the fire, God spoke. He identified himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He told Moses he had seen the affliction of his people in Egypt. He had heard their cry. He had come down to deliver them, and he was sending Moses to do it. What follows in Exodus 3 and 4 is one of the most genuinely human moments in all of Scripture, because Moses, the man standing at the burning bush, the man being commissioned by the God of the universe to liberate an enslaved nation, spent the better part of several conversations trying to get out of it. He said, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? God said, I will be with you. Moses said, What is your name? What shall I say when they ask who sent me? God said, I am who I am. Tell them I am sent you. Moses said, but they will not believe me. God gave him 3 miraculous signs: a staff that became a serpent, a leprous hand that was healed, water that turned to blood. And still, Moses resisted. Moses said, I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. God said, I made your mouth. I will be with you and teach you what to say. And then Moses said what no one who has ever studied this passage can read without a sharp recognition of their own humanity. He said, Please, Lord, send someone else. At that point, the text says, God's anger burned against Moses. But even in his anger, God accommodated Moses. He said, Your brother Aaron is already coming to meet you. He will be your spokesman. You will hold the staff. Together, you will go. It was settled. Moses was going back to Egypt, the country where he was wanted for murder, to confront the most powerful monarch on earth, to demand the release of 2 million enslaved people on behalf of a God that most of Egypt had never heard of. He went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and asked permission to return to his own people in Egypt. Jethro said simply, Go in peace. And Moses packed his family, Zipporah, their 2 sons Gershom and Eleazar, and a wooden staff that had become something more than a shepherd's tool, and set out on the road to Egypt. We do not know what Zipporah said when Moses told her what had happened at the burning bush. We cannot know. The Bible does not record this conversation, and that absence, that silence at the exact moment when the most important conversation of their marriage was taking place, is one of the most frustrating gaps in the entire Exodus narrative. What we can say with certainty is this. Zipporah went. She packed their sons. She loaded everything onto the donkeys. She left Midian, left her father's household, left the landscape she had known all her life, left the network of her sisters and her community, and the specific comfort of a familiar world. And she walked toward Egypt. She walked toward the country where her husband was wanted for murder. She walked toward the confrontation between Moses and the most powerful ruler on earth. She walked toward everything that was about to happen, not knowing what any of it would cost her. She chose to go. This is the moment, this specific act of choosing to follow Moses into the most dangerous assignment any person has ever been given, that reveals something essential about who Zipporah was. She was not a passive figure. She was not a woman who was simply carried along by the decisions of the men around her. She was not naive about what Egypt meant, or what Pharaoh meant, or what it would mean for Moses to walk into the royal court and say, "Let my people go." She was the daughter of a priest who had served as an advisor to Pharaoh. She understood the political dynamics of the ancient world. She understood power. She understood what happened to people who challenged Pharaoh in his own throne room. And she went anyway. Because Moses asked her to, because God had commissioned him, because there were 2 million people in Egypt whose freedom depended on Moses completing his mission, and because Zipporah, in every documented choice she made, was a woman who moved toward the thing that mattered most, even when it cost her everything. Here is the theological complexity that the narrative is building toward, and that scholars have been grappling with for centuries. Moses' 5 objections at the burning bush were not simply about public inadequacy. They were not simply about whether he could speak well enough or whether Pharaoh would listen. They revealed a man whose relationship with the covenant God was itself deficient, a man who did not yet fully trust the promises that God had made to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. And the evidence of that deficiency was already present in Moses' household before God even appeared in the burning bush. It was present in the uncircumcised flesh of his son. Moses was about to represent the covenant people to the entire world, and the fundamental sign of that covenant, the sign that God had given Abraham in Genesis 17 as the physical mark distinguishing those who belonged to him from those who did not, was missing in Moses' own tent. He was carrying the covenant call on his lips, but not the covenant sign in his home. What happened next is the moment that makes Zipporah one of the most remarkable figures in all of ancient literature. Somewhere on the road between Midian and Egypt, at a roadside lodging place where the family stopped to rest for the night, God appeared. And he did not appear to encourage Moses. He appeared to execute him. Exodus 4:24. Let those words land exactly as they were written. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Those are not the words of a metaphor. Those are not the words of a difficult vision or a theological abstraction. The Lord met him and sought to put him to death. God had just commissioned Moses at the burning bush. God had just given him miraculous signs. God had just told him, I will be with you. And now, on the road to the mission, God came to the inn in the dark of night and began to kill him. The question that has driven 3,000 years of scholarly debate is simply this: why? What could Moses have done? What line could he possibly have crossed? That would bring the God who had just commissioned him to a roadside inn in the middle of the desert to execute him before the mission even began. The answer, as the text makes brutally clear in the verse that follows, is circumcision. Specifically, the absence of it. According to Genesis 17, when God made his covenant with Abraham, he instituted circumcision as the physical sign of that covenant. He was unambiguous about this. He said, every male among you shall be circumcised. Every male on the 8th day. And then God said the words that Exodus 4 would bring roaring back into relevance. Any uncircumcised male shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Cut off. Not warned, not placed on probation, cut off. And Moses, the man commissioned to go and remind Pharaoh of the power and holiness of the covenant God, had an uncircumcised son in his household. The covenant's founding sign was absent in the home of the man who was about to represent that covenant to the world. The Talmud, in Tractate Nedarim 31b through 32a, wrestles with exactly why Moses had failed to circumcise his son. The rabbinical debate is illuminating. Some argue that Moses delayed the circumcision because he was consumed by the urgency of departing for Egypt. That preparation and logistics had taken priority at the inn. Others argue that Zipporah had resisted the rite, that as a Midianite woman, she found the rite either foreign to her tradition or painful to contemplate for her son, and that she had resisted it, and that Moses, rather than insisting on the covenant's requirement, had accommodated her resistance and left their son uncircumcised. Mary Elizabeth Baxter, the 19th century biblical scholar who wrote one of the earliest detailed studies of Zipporah, described this tension with striking directness. She wrote that circumcision was evidently a stumbling block to Zipporah, that she had certain ideas of her own which she did not willingly yield, and that this difference of opinion between husband and wife had been a source of friction in their household for some time before the crisis at the inn. Here is where the story moves from the theological into the deeply personal. And if Baxter's reading is correct, and there is significant rabbinic support for it, then the night at the roadside inn is even more charged than it first appears. Because what Zipporah did that night was not simply perform a rite that Moses had neglected to perform. She overcame her own resistance to perform it. She acted against her own prior position. Whatever she had felt about circumcision before, whatever objection, whatever cultural discomfort, whatever maternal protectiveness had caused her to oppose it, all of that was overridden in a single moment when she saw her husband dying on the ground and understood what was killing him. She understood in the way that only someone raised at the feet of a priest could understand in that moment, that this was not a medical emergency. This was a covenantal one. And the solution was not prayer. The solution was blood. The solution was the covenant sign applied now, tonight, in the dark, with whatever was at hand. Somehow, in the dark of that roadside inn, in the middle of the night, with her husband dying or incapacitated or under divine judgment on the floor in front of her, Zipporah understood what was happening, not vaguely, not after a long period of prayer and discernment. Immediately. She diagnosed the crisis, identified the remedy, and executed the solution with the steady hands of someone who had been prepared for exactly this moment by every year of her life. The text says, She took a flint stone, ancient Near Eastern surgery, a sharp piece of rock used for exactly this kind of rite throughout the region for thousands of years, and she performed the circumcision of her son. And then she touched the foreskin to Moses' feet, an act loaded with ritual significance that scholars still debate. And she spoke words that have never been fully explained in 3,000 years of trying. Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. Hatan damim. These two Hebrew words, found only in this passage in the entire Bible, have generated more academic literature per syllable than almost any other phrase in the Old Testament. The word Hatan means bridegroom, but it also means kinsman by marriage, the one who has become bound to you through covenant. The word damim means blood, a bridegroom of blood, a kinsman sealed in blood. She was speaking something deeply covenantal, she was saying, in the language of sacred ritual, that the blood being shed in this circumcision was the blood that sealed the covenant between this man and his God. William Propp's analysis, published in the journal Vetus Testamentum, examines the phrase from every possible linguistic angle and concludes that its ambiguity is not accidental. That the ancient text was preserving a sacred phrase whose full meaning was already somewhat archaic, even when Exodus was being composed. Bernard Robinson's complimentary study, titled Zipporah to the Rescue, published in the same journal, emphasizes that Zipporah's action here is not merely reactive. She was not guessing, not improvising blindly. Robinson uses the phrase contextually apt to describe her intervention, meaning she knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. And then, verse 26. So he let him alone. 5 syllables. The shortest climax to the most charged crisis in the entire book of Exodus. God relented. Moses lived. And Zipporah stood in that roadside inn with blood on her hands and with the full weight of what she had just done settling around her like the desert silence after a storm. She had saved him. Not an angel, not Aaron, not God's mercy extended through prayer or petition or miraculous intervention from heaven. A woman, a Midianite woman who had never belonged to the covenant people, who had grown up outside the tradition, who had been raised in the household of a Midianite priest rather than an Israelite patriarch. She had looked into the darkness and seen what was killing her husband when he could not see it himself. She had known the remedy when the appointed leader of Israel was lying motionless on the ground. She had acted when acting required a courage and a clarity that must have felt like something beyond herself. And God let him alone. For 3,000 years, the greatest minds in Jewish and Christian scholarship have argued about what exactly happened at that roadside inn. And they have not agreed yet. The Jewish tradition preserved in the Talmud focuses on the question of blame. Who was responsible for the uncircumcised son? And what exactly was the nature of Moses' sin? The Talmud in Tractate Nedarim presents 2 competing answers, and neither one entirely satisfies the text. One answer says Moses delayed the circumcision for practical reasons. The other says Zipporah resisted, and Moses accommodated her resistance. Both agree on the outcome. The sign was absent, the covenant was violated, and God enforced it. What they disagree on is where the moral weight falls. And the question of where that weight falls matters, because it determines how we understand everything Zipporah did next. The early Christian interpreters of this passage, theologians like Origen in the 3rd century and Jerome in the 4th, read the passage typologically. They saw Moses' near death as a foreshadowing of Christ's death and resurrection. They saw the blood of circumcision as prefiguring atoning blood. They saw Zipporah functioning as a type of the church, the people of God preserving the covenantal relationship when the appointed leader cannot preserve it himself. This is a high theological reading, and it does something significant. It elevates Zipporah's act from a desperate improvisation to a sacred function. It says she was not simply responding to an emergency. She was performing a priestly act with salvific consequences, and given that she was the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, this reading is not as far from the text as it might initially appear. Feminist biblical scholars in the 20th and 21st centuries have brought a different lens to this passage, and what they found was equally significant. Carol Myers, in her authoritative study Women in Scripture, and Phyllis Tribal, in her landmark work, Texts of Terror. Both argue that Zipporah is the theological hero of this passage in a way that the text's focus on Moses has historically obscured. She is not merely facilitating her husband's covenant. She is independently executing a priestly function. She operates as priestess. Her father was a priest, so her action was priestly. This was a woman doing sacred work in a moment when the appointed man could not. And the fact that Scripture records her words, hatan damim, in direct speech, while recording nothing that Moses said or did during the entire event, is itself an argument from the structure of the narrative. Zipporah is the actor. Moses is the object. The text knows the difference even when the reader doesn't notice it. And here is what the evidence of this story actually shows if you follow it carefully and refuse to look away. In the moment that mattered most, the moment that determined whether the Exodus happened or did not happen, Moses did not know what to do. Moses, who had spoken face to face with God at the burning bush, who had been given miraculous signs, who had been commissioned with the most important divine mission in Israelite history, who was on the road to Egypt specifically because God had sent him there. In that moment, at that roadside inn, Moses was incapacitated. He was lying on the ground. He was the object of divine judgment. And the person who moved was Zipporah, the outsider, the Midianite, the woman who had prior to that night resisted the very rite she was now performing. She was the one with the knowledge. She was the one with the courage. She was the one who moved. After the night at the inn, Moses continued toward Egypt, but he did not continue with Zipporah. At some point between that roadside inn and the arrival at the Egyptian border, the text is not specific about when Moses sent Zipporah away. Exodus 18:2 contains this quiet and devastating phrase, Moses had sent her away. The Hebrew word is shalach, the same word used elsewhere for dismissal, for sending someone back, for the act of formal separation. He sent her away, back to Midian, back to Jethro's household, back to the desert she had grown up in. She took their 2 sons, Gershom and Eleazar, and she went. And Moses entered Egypt without her. He stood before Pharaoh without her. He called down 10 plagues without her. He led 2 million people across a divided sea without her. And Zipporah sat in Midian, waiting, hearing second-hand reports of the impossible things her husband was doing on the other side of the desert without her. Why did Moses send her away? Scripture does not say. And that silence has produced centuries of speculation and debate. The most generous reading is protective. Egypt was about to become the most dangerous place on earth. The 10 plagues would devastate the country. Disease would sweep through the livestock. Hail would destroy the crops. Darkness would swallow the land for 3 days. And in the final plague, the firstborn of every household in Egypt would die in a single night. Moses may have sent Zipporah and Gershom and Eleazar home to save them from the catastrophe he was about to call down on the land. Sending them home was the act of a man who loved his family enough to choose their safety over his own desire to have them close. That is the generous reading, and it may well be the true one. But the Makilta de Rabbi Ishmael, one of the oldest of the rabbinic legal commentaries on Exodus, preserves a tradition that complicates this interpretation considerably. It records that it was Aaron who told Moses to send Zipporah away. Aaron said to Moses, "We are already grieving for the first ones, for the Israelites suffering in Egypt. Shall we now grieve for these as well?" "There is no room," Aaron was saying, "for Zipporah and the boys in the midst of what we are about to walk into. The mission is too consuming. The suffering ahead is too great. Send them home." And Moses, according to this tradition, obeyed his brother. Picture that decision. The woman who had saved Moses' life just days earlier on the road. The woman who had reached into a divine crisis with a flint knife and pulled Moses back from the edge of it, was being sent home on the advice of the man who had not been there, who had not seen it, who did not know what she had done in the dark. The Exodus happened. The plagues fell. Each one targeted a specific Egyptian god. The Nile running to blood was an assault on Hapi, the god of the flood. The darkness that could be felt for 3 days was a direct strike against Ra, the sun god, the patron deity of Pharaoh himself. The death of the firstborn was the final dismantling of the divine claim of the pharaonic household. One by one, every power that Egypt's religious system claimed to possess was shown to be nothing before the God of Israel. And through all of it, Moses stood. The man who had argued with a burning bush, the man who had said, "Please send someone else," the man whose wife had saved him on the road. That man stood before Pharaoh 10 times and 10 times called down catastrophe on the most powerful empire on earth without flinching. And then came the sea. Pharaoh, whose own son had died in the night of the final plague, gave Moses the words he had come for. Go. The Israelites rose in the dark and walked out of Egypt carrying everything they could hold. They carried unleavened bread because there was no time to wait for it to rise. They carried gold and silver pressed into their hands by Egyptians who wanted them gone at any cost. 2 million people walked out of the country that had enslaved their families for 430 years, and Pharaoh changed his mind. He sent his army after them, 600 of his finest chariots, his horsemen, his officers, pursuing a people on foot through the wilderness toward the sea. And then Moses stretched his hand over the water, and the sea divided. 2 million people walked across the floor of the Red Sea on dry ground, while the walls of water stood on either side of them. That sentence should be read slowly. The floor of the sea. On dry ground, and on the far side of that crossing, Israel burst into song. Miriam, Moses' sister, took a tambourine in her hand and led the women in dancing and singing. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The entire nation was singing. The air was alive with music and relief, and the particular joy that only comes after a liberation so long awaited. It had stopped feeling real. Moses sang. Aaron stood at his side. The tribes of Israel lifted their voices together for the first time as a free people. And Zipporah was in Midian, drawing water, watching the horizon, waiting for a husband she had last seen somewhere on a desert road before the world had changed. She did not go to Egypt for the Exodus. She was not there when the lamb's blood was painted on the doorposts. She was not there when the Israelites rose in the dark and gathered their unleavened bread. She was not on the far bank of the sea when Israel sang for the first time as a free people. She did not hear Miriam's tambourine. She did not see the walls of water on either side of the path across the floor of the sea. She was in Midian, raising Gershom and Eleazar, managing a household, living the ordinary life of a woman whose extraordinary contribution to the most extraordinary moment in her civilization's history would not be recorded in any song, commemorated in any ritual, or mentioned in any public celebration of what had just happened. 2 million people walked free, and the woman who had kept the man who led them alive, who had held the choke point of human history open with her bare hands, was at her father's house, listening to secondhand reports, alone with the knowledge of what she had done. News traveled slowly in the ancient world, not in minutes or hours, but in the weeks and months it took for traders and travelers to carry information across the desert routes between Egypt and Arabia. Zipporah would have heard things. She would have heard, in fragments and rumors, that something was happening in Egypt, that the Nile had turned to blood, that frogs had covered the land, that a darkness had come down over the entire country for 3 days, a darkness so thick, according to the text of Exodus 10, that it could be felt. She would have heard about the death of the firstborn and the cry that went up from Egypt at midnight. She would have heard that the Hebrews had walked out. She would have heard that the sea had divided. She would have heard that the greatest army in the world had been swallowed by the returning water. And every single piece of that news, every plague, every miracle, every act of liberation had been made possible by what she had done at a roadside inn, alone, in the dark, with a piece of flint. Jethro heard everything that God had done for Moses and for Israel, And Jethro, the priest of Midian, the man who had sheltered a fugitive Egyptian and recognized something in him long before the rest of the world did, took Zipporah and her 2 sons and brought them to Moses in the wilderness camp. Note whose initiative this was. Jethro brought her. Moses sent for her after the Exodus. Jethro brought her. There is a difference in those 2 sentences that is small in length and large in implication. And when the reunion is recorded in the text, the detailed description is reserved for Moses and Jethro. They embraced, they kissed, they asked after each other's well-being. They went into the tent together and talked deep into the night. Jethro rejoiced when he heard everything the Lord had done for Moses and for Israel. And Zipporah's reunion with Moses is not described. Not one word. Not one sentence. The text records that Jethro brought her. It does not record that Moses ran to meet her. The Jewish Women's Archive describes this pattern as the neglect of Zipporah, and uses that precise phrase, neglect, deliberately. Moses' treatment of Zipporah after the inn is a pattern, not a single event. Exodus 19 records Moses telling the men of Israel to abstain from women in preparation for God's appearance at Mount Sinai. And scholars, including Carol Myers, note that Moses himself apparently maintained this practice continuously, since Moses was always in preparation for another divine encounter. Always holding himself ready for the next conversation with God, he seems to have maintained a permanent state of ritual separation that precluded normal marital life with Zipporah altogether. She was present in the camp, she was his wife, and he appears to have lived, in practical terms, as though the marriage had been suspended in the service of his calling. The Midrash records something remarkable about how Zipporah processed this. It says she found a sympathetic ear in Miriam, that the 2 women formed a bond, that Miriam lent her attention and understanding to Zipporah's grief over the distance between herself and Moses. What Jethro did when he arrived in the Israelite camp is one of the most quietly remarkable episodes in the entire wilderness narrative. Moses was spending every day from morning to evening serving as the sole judge for every dispute among 2 million people. Every complaint, every conflict, every legal question funneled up to Moses alone. Jethro watched this for one day, and then he said to Moses, "What you are doing is not good. You and the people with you will wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone." And then Jethro, the Midianite priest, the outsider, the man who had never been part of the covenant people, gave Moses a governance model. Appoint capable men to serve as judges over thousands, over hundreds, over 50s, over 10s. Let them handle the small cases. Bring only the major cases to you. This organizational structure became the judicial backbone of the Israelite nation, and it came from a Midianite, Zipporah's father, the man who had first welcomed Moses into his household when Moses had nothing. After Jethro departed and returned to his own land, the wilderness journey continued. Israel arrived at the mountain of God, the same mountain where Moses had first heard the divine voice in the burning bush. And at that mountain, God descended. The text says the mountain was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The whole mountain trembled greatly, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. And Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The people of Israel stood at the base of the mountain and were so terrified that they said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die." And Moses went up the mountain. The man who had stood before Pharaoh 10 times without fear stood before God on a mountain that was shaking and on fire. And God gave him the law, the 10 commandments, the Sabbath, the laws of sacrifice and justice and covenant fidelity, the instructions for the tabernacle. All of it delivered through Moses, the man who had been dying on the floor of an inn a few months earlier while his wife performed an emergency circumcision to stop God from executing him. We should stay in the silence about Zipporah for a moment, not to fill it with speculation, but to sit with what it means. She had chosen to come to this camp. She had chosen to leave Midian a second time and live among a people who were not her people, in a wilderness that was harsh and uncertain. following a man whose access to God was so singular and so consuming that it left almost no room for ordinary human relationship. Zipporah was the daughter of a priest. She understood sacred calling. She understood what it cost a family when the person called to sacred work was permanently occupied at the intersection of the human and the divine. She had watched her father Jethro carry that weight for an entire lifetime, and now she was watching Moses carry it. Except Moses carried it at a scale that made even Jethro's priesthood look manageable. And the Midrash says the weight of it was hard for her, that she carried her grief quietly, and that it was Miriam who listened. Numbers 12:1 is a verse that most Bible readers encounter, note briefly, and then move past without fully registering what it is saying or why it is saying it. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. Two things happen simultaneously in this verse. The first is that a woman is named as the reason for a challenge to Moses' authority. The second is that the woman is described in a way that scholars have never been able to fully resolve. She is called a Cushite woman. Cushite, in the geography of the ancient Near East, refers to the territory south and west of Egypt, modern-day Sudan, and Ethiopia. The question that has divided scholarship for 3,000 years is this: is this Cushite woman Zipporah, described by an unusual geographic term, or is this a different woman entirely? A second wife Moses had taken from a completely different culture and background? The two major interpretive schools are clear in their positions. On one side, scholars arguing that the Cushite woman is Zipporah point to the fact that no other wife of Moses is ever explicitly documented in the biblical text. No children of a second marriage are ever recorded. And, as the Torah.com documents in its detailed scholarly analysis, the word Cushite in the ancient Near East was sometimes applied to people from the region of Midian itself. The book of Habakkuk 3:7 places the tents of Cushan in direct parallelism with the curtains of Midian, suggesting the two terms could refer to overlapping geographic territories. Furthermore, the ancient Sifrei Zuta, a Tannaitic midrash, makes the argument explicitly. Just as Cushites are distinct from other people because of their appearance, so was Zipporah distinct in her appearance and her deeds from all other women. On this reading, Cushite is not a geographic identification. It is a description of distinction. Zipporah was called the Cushite woman because she was exceptional. On the other side, scholars who believe this was a different woman entirely point to the tradition preserved in the writings of the ancient historian Josephus and in the Midrashic tradition of the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, that Moses had been a military commander in Ethiopia long before the Exodus. Artapanus of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, records that Moses led an Egyptian army against the Ethiopians and captured their capital. Josephus elaborates this story in his Antiquities of the Jews, naming Moses' Ethiopian wife as Tharbis, one the daughter of the king of the Ethiopians. According to this tradition, Moses married Tharbis before he killed the Egyptian taskmaster and fled to Midian, meaning that when Miriam and Aaron speak of the Cushite woman in Numbers 12, they are speaking of this Ethiopian queen from Moses' pre-Midian past, not of Zipporah at all. This tradition is ancient, it is widely preserved, and it cannot simply be dismissed. The Samaritan Pentateuch offers a third resolution to this puzzle that is striking in its simplicity. As documented at intertextual.bible, the Samaritan version of Numbers 12:1 does not read Cushite woman at all. It reads beautiful woman. The Samaritan tradition pronounces the Hebrew consonants differently, Kaashet rather than Cushit, and the result is a verse that reads, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the beautiful woman whom he had married, for he had married a beautiful woman. And the Samaritan commentary identifies this beautiful woman explicitly as Zipporah. On the Samaritan reading, there was no second wife. There was only Zipporah. And the word that has generated 3,000 years of debate was a pronunciation difference, a scribal variation that transformed the word for beautiful into the word for Cushite and turned one woman into two. But here is what the text of Numbers 12 makes unmistakably clear, regardless of which resolution you accept. The wife is not actually the point. The wife is the pretext. Verse 2, immediately following the reference to the Cushite woman, reveals the real agenda. And they said, "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also?" This is a power struggle. Miriam and Aaron want recognition. They are prophets too. Miriam had led Israel in song at the sea. Aaron had served as Moses' spokesman before Pharaoh. Both of them had been faithful through the wilderness. And now they are looking at Moses' unique and extraordinary access to God. This man who speaks with God not in visions or dreams, but face to face, mouth to mouth. And they are saying, why him? Why only him? The wife is the argument. The authority is the subject. And it is not a coincidence that a woman's identity was used as the leverage point for an attack on a man's leadership. God's response was immediate and unambiguous. He called Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to the tent of meeting. He came down in a pillar of cloud, and he spoke the words of Numbers 12:6 through 8. Words that are among the most direct and absolute divine declarations in the entire Pentateuch. God said, "When there is a prophet among you, I make myself known to him in a vision, in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is entrusted with all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" Moses' access to God was categorically different from any other prophet's. Not because Moses was perfect. The circumcision incident at the inn had made clear that Moses was capable of significant spiritual failure, but because God had chosen it to be so, and that choice was not subject to challenge by Moses' siblings or anyone else. The anger of the Lord burned, and when the cloud lifted from the tent of meeting, Miriam was leprous, white as snow. Aaron looked at her and said to Moses, "Do not punish us for the sin that we have committed in foolishness." Aaron's immediate repentance suggests that he recognized, faster than Miriam did, that they had fundamentally misread the situation. The verb in Numbers 12:1 for spoke against is in the Hebrew a grammatically feminine singular form, suggesting Miriam was the primary instigator, and Aaron was drawn in rather than independently motivated. The judgment fell on Miriam. And Moses, the most humble man on the face of the earth, according to the same chapter's description of him, did not defend himself during the attack. He said nothing in his own defense. He let God speak. And then, when judgment fell on his sister, Moses cried out to God on her behalf, "Oh God, please heal her, please." The man who had just been slandered to his face was the first to pray for his accuser's healing. The entire Israelite camp waited during Miriam's 7 days outside the camp. 2 million people suspended at the edge of their journey, waiting for one woman to be restored. The text of Numbers 12:15 records this with a particular emphasis. Miriam was shut outside the camp 7 days, and the people did not set out on the march until Miriam was brought in again. The nation waited for her. Whatever her challenge to Moses' authority had cost her, her importance to the community was such that Israel would not move without her. After 7 days, and Miriam was healed and brought back in, the people moved on. The challenge was over. Moses' unique authority had been vindicated by the highest possible source. And Zipporah, the woman at the center of the opening argument, the Cushite woman for whom Miriam and Aaron claimed to have spoken, the woman whose identity had been used as a weapon against her husband, is not mentioned again. Not then. Not ever. After Numbers 12:1, in which she appears only as the subject of other people's criticism without being given a voice, Zipporah is gone from the record of Scripture. Here is what we do not know. We do not know whether Zipporah stood at the foot of Mount Sinai when the law was given and the mountain burned. We do not know whether she was in the camp when Moses came down from the mountain the second time, with his face shining so brightly from God's presence that the Israelites were afraid to look at him, and he had to put a veil over his face to speak with them. We do not know whether she outlived the wilderness years, or whether she died before Israel reached the plains of Moab. We do not know whether Moses was with her when she died, or whether he was on the mountain or in the tent of meeting, as he so often was, between God and the people, occupying the space that allowed no room for a wife. The biblical narrative simply moves on. It does not ask what Zipporah thought. It does not record her final word. It does not give her the dignity of a closing scene. She dissolves into the silence that the text has assigned to her from the beginning. Moses himself never entered the Promised Land. This is perhaps the most famous divine judgment in all of Scripture. The man who had led Israel for 40 years through the wilderness, who had interceded for them every time they sinned, who had spoken with God as a friend speaks with a friend, was told at the end of his life that he would see Canaan but not enter it. Because at a place called Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, Moses struck a rock with his staff when God had told him to speak to it. One moment of anger, one act of disobedience in 40 years of extraordinary faithfulness, and God said, "You will see the land from a distance. You will not cross." The book of Deuteronomy records his final days, his song of warning to the people, his blessing over the 12 tribes, his transfer of authority to Joshua, his last words delivered to a nation that was about to enter without him. Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab. The mountain sits in what is today the Kingdom of Jordan, approximately 700 meters above sea level, looking westward across the Jordan River Valley toward Canaan. Deuteronomy 34 records that the Lord showed Moses all the land from the summit, from Gilead as far as Dan, all the territory of Naphtali, Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah extending to the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, the valley of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zoar. And then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said I will give it to your descendants. I have now allowed you to see it with your own eyes, but you will not enter the land." And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab. He was 120 years old when he died. His eyesight was still clear, and his strength had not diminished. The Lord buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, near a place called Beth Peor, and no one knows where his grave is to this day. The greatest prophet of Israel, the man who had spoken with God, face to face, the man who had parted the sea and given the law, and led 2 million people through the wilderness for 40 years, was buried in an unmarked grave by God himself. And the Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses ended. And Joshua son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom, because Moses had laid his hands on him. And the Israelites listened to Joshua and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. Life moved on. History moved on. The name of Moses would be spoken for 3,500 years. The name of Zipporah would, for most of those years, barely be spoken at all. Think about what was at stake at the roadside inn that night. Not just Moses' life, though that alone would be extraordinary enough. Think about everything that depended on Moses surviving that night. The 10 plagues depended on Moses living. The confrontation with Pharaoh depended on Moses living. The Passover night, when the angel of death passed over the houses marked with lamb's blood, depended on Moses living. The parting of the sea depended on Moses living. The giving of the law at Sinai, the 10 Commandments, the framework of justice and morality that has shaped Western civilization for 3,000 years, depended on Moses living. The covenant with Israel, the tabernacle, the entire wilderness journey, the entry into Canaan. All of it passed through a single choke point on a desert road one night, and the person holding that choke point open was Zipporah, a Midianite woman with a piece of flint and the theological knowledge to use it correctly. Before we bring this story to its close, consider the pattern of women who saved Moses before Moses could save anyone else. Jochebed placed him in the basket in the Nile, saving him from Pharaoh's genocide decree. Pharaoh's own daughter rescued the basket from the water and raised Moses in the palace, giving him the education that made everything possible. Miriam watched her baby brother in the river and negotiated his return to his own mother, ensuring that Moses grew up knowing who he was. and Zipporah saved Moses from divine judgment at the roadside inn, ensuring that the mission reached Egypt at all. Before Moses could save anyone, 4 women had to save him. The Exodus is, in ways that are rarely preached, a story about women's courage making men's destiny possible. And at the root of all of it, one woman with a flint stone, alone in the dark, doing what had to be done. The legacy of Zipporah is not celebrated in a feast day. It is not commemorated in a liturgical rite. There is no section of the Passover Seder that pauses to acknowledge what she did at the roadside inn. There is no prayer that mentions her name. In the centuries following the composition of Exodus, the rabbis discussed her in their commentaries, and those commentaries survive, and they are sometimes deeply perceptive about what Zipporah represents. But the popular imagination, the cultural memory, the story that gets told when Exodus gets told, has consistently centered Moses. He is the face of the burning bush. He is the hand that parts the sea. He is the name on the mountain. And Zipporah stands behind him, in the category of people whose indispensability to the story has never been adequately translated into recognition. History does this to women. It has always done this. It records the acts of the men at the center of the stage and allows the women who held the stage together to fade from the picture. What does that mean for us? It means that the people who are doing the most critical work are not always the people in the spotlight. Zipporah did her work in the dark at an anonymous roadside inn with no audience and no record of thanks. Her contribution to the Exodus is real, whether or not it is remembered. It means wisdom comes from outside the expected source. Zipporah was a Midianite. She was not one of the covenant people. And yet she understood the covenant better than the man God had just commissioned to lead it. Never assume that the person standing outside the tradition cannot see it more clearly than those standing inside it. And it means there are people in your life right now who have done for you what Zipporah did for Moses. Insani intervened at a critical moment, who saw what was going wrong when you couldn't, who acted when you were in no position to act, who saved something important while you were not in a position to save it yourself. Some of those people are famous to you. Some of them are forgotten. All of them matter. Zipporah was the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian. She was the wife of Moses. She was the mother of Gershom and Eleazar. She was a Midianite woman who married a Hebrew fugitive at a desert well and chose to follow him to Egypt when Egypt was the most dangerous place on earth. She was the woman who, on a night that Scripture records in 3 verses and most preachers skip entirely, reached into the darkness with a piece of flint and performed the act that kept the Exodus alive. She was the woman who said, Hatan Damim, bridegroom of blood, and meant by it something so theologically precise and so covenantally accurate that God himself, who had come to the inn to execute judgment, relented. She was the woman who was sent home before the drama reached its climax, who waited in Midian while the world changed without her, who came back because her father brought her rather than because her husband sent for her, and who faded from the text of Scripture without a recorded death, without a final word, without a closing scene that gave her the dignity of a proper ending. She did all of that, and Zipporah is at the source. So here is what I want to leave you with tonight. After everything we have walked through together, there is a question that this story raises. A question that every man or woman who has ever contributed to something important without receiving full credit for it has already lived from the inside. The question is this: does it matter whether you are remembered? Does it matter whether the record reflects what you actually did? Does the value of an act, does the weight of a sacrifice, does the truth of a contribution depend on whether anyone else acknowledges it? Zipporah's act at the roadside inn was real whether or not the text recorded it. It was consequential whether or not the preachers mention it. It enabled the Exodus whether or not the Passover Seder says her name. The history of the world was shaped by what she did in that tent, and the world's failure to remember it clearly does not reduce what she did by a single syllable. The act stands. The flint stone touched flesh. The blood was shed. The covenant was sealed. God relented. Moses lived. And everything that followed, every plague, every miracle, every law carved in stone, every soul who has ever found meaning in the story of a people delivered from bondage, every civilization that has been shaped by the moral framework that came down from Sinai, everything followed from that night. Zipporah made it possible, and now, at least in this moment, you know her name. 3,500 years after she knelt in the dark of a roadside inn in the Sinai wilderness and did the thing that no one else on earth could have done in that moment. You know her name. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything she deserved. Say it out loud if you are willing. Zipporah, the wife of Moses, the woman who saved the man who saved a nation, the woman without whom there would be no Exodus. Say her name. Now, I want to hear from you. After spending this time with Zipporah's story, what moved you most? Was it the night at the inn? Was it the dismissal on the road to Egypt? Was it her disappearance from the biblical record after Numbers 12? Or was it something else? Something about the way this story speaks to the people in your own life who have held the choke point open for you without receiving the credit they deserved. Tell us in the comments right now. We read every single one. And here is the question I want you to think about and answer. If Zipporah had not acted that night at the roadside inn, if she had panicked, if she had waited for Moses to recover, if she had done nothing with her hands, do you believe the Exodus would still have happened? Would God have found another way? Or was Zipporah truly irreplaceable? Leave your answer in the comments. This is a conversation that has been waiting 3,000 years to happen. Before we go, we want to say one more time. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We have viewers joining us from all over the world, and we genuinely love to hear from every one of you. If this story reached something in you, if you found yourself learning something you didn't expect to learn, feeling something you didn't expect to feel, seeing a woman in Scripture you had never truly seen before, then there are thousands more stories like this one. Hidden people, forgotten figures, the ones who were in the room when history was made but were never put on the monument, the ones whose names the record dropped but whose acts the world could not have survived without. That is what we do here. We find the people history forgot, and we give them their hour. If you are not yet subscribed, hit that subscribe button right now, and you will never miss what comes next. Because what comes next is a story just as old, just as hidden, and just as important as the one you just finished. And it begins, as all the best stories do, with a question nobody thought to ask. We will see you there.